The Democracy That Delivers podcast is brought to you today by the Anti-Corruption and Governance Center at CIPE. This is the podcast where we talk about corruption in its many forms. And now to your host, Eric Hans.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the podcast. My name is Eric Hans. I'm the director for the Center for Accountable Investment here at CIPE. And today I'm pleased to welcome Raymond Baker, who really is a gentleman who needs no introduction in certain circles in Washington and has been a longtime advocate for bringing transparency and accountability to the financial system. It's really an honor to have him on the podcast with us today. He recently launched a new book called Invisible Trillions. Hopefully we'll get into that. But first, I'd like to turn it over to Raymond to talk a bit about his experience, his work, and what led him up to issuing and writing this book, Invisible Trillions.
Thank you, Eric, and delighted to be on with you. I have spent a lifetime looking at illicit dealings in the capitalist system. I spent 15 years living in Nigeria, where I saw a lot of this stuff. I've done business all over the rest of the world and have repeatedly seen illicit dealings. And finally, it got to me to the point that I decided I had to say something. I segued into the think tank world in 1997. And in 2005, published my first book, Capitalism's Achilles Heel, and formed Global Financial Integrity to address the issues that we are talking about, illicit money and its effects on the world. The reason that I have written a second book is because both our organization, Global Financial Integrity, and 10 or 12 other organizations have been working on these issues and not making as much progress as we think we should make. Various organizations are working on issues of corruption and money laundering and tax evasion and human trafficking and so forth. And none of us are getting as much traction as we can. And I finally decided several years ago, the reason for this is because we're all addressing particular aspects of this problem and not sufficiently addressing the overarching reality. And I realized that in order to make progress in this issue, we had to recognize that we are, in fact, dealing with an existential threat to the democratic capitalist system. And dealing with a threat to the democratic capitalist system. And so I decided to write a second book that, while it addresses the particularistic issues, it's much more focused on bringing into our consciousness that this problem is bigger than a lot of little aspects of the problem.
So it's bigger than one oligarch or one corrupt dictator siphoning off oil revenue or natural resource proceeds. It goes a lot deeper than that.
Exactly. We're dealing with a systemic challenge. We're dealing with a systemic issue. And just like the way that we approach climate change, scientists and experts knew that global warming was a reality back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, but it wasn't getting very far. Finally, Al Gore comes along and he elevates these issues to the existential level. And now people get it. So, I'm not Al Gore, but I would like to be able to contribute to getting these issues that I'm dealing with into a higher level of understanding. Global warming is now in the global consciousness. I would like to see dirty money get much more embedded into the global consciousness.
Well, I mean, you do go through a number of ways in which it impacts normal people. And there's a number of other authors out there. American Kleptocracy is a recent book showing the impact of kleptocratic systems within the United States and how it affects the average person living in Cincinnati. So I think that more about this, writing about this and how these bigger complex systems affect everyday people and the systems which we live, it does a lot to kind of garner support to the cause, as it were. At CIPE, we talk about this issue of corrosive capital. And I talk about this a lot at the Center for Accountable Investment. And that's capital that enters a market that's opaque, that's unaccountable to shareholders or stakeholders. and it doesn't necessarily have a profit motive. You go into your book, you talk about this corroding commons. And so I picked up on that word, the corroding commons. Could you walk us through what is the corroding commons in your mind, and how is it applicable or not to this idea of corrosive capital that we're dealing with at SIPE?
Something utterly fundamental has happened in the capitalist system over the past half century, 60 years or so. And that is secrecy has become as important as profitability. And so we in the Western countries have created an entire financial secrecy system, the purpose of which is to move and shelter and hide money that can't be seen. This financial secrecy system has a lot of elements: tax havens, secrecy jurisdictions, disguised corporations in the millions, tens of millions around the world, more of them created in the United States than in any other country. Anonymous trust accounts, fake foundations, specialized money laundering techniques. And finally, part of this system is holes left in the laws of the United States and other countries that facilitate the movement of money through this financial secrecy system and ultimately into our own economies. One of the points that I make over and over again is that every single element of the financial secrecy system was created by us in the richer Western countries. Not a single element of this system has been created by drug dealers or criminal syndicates or kleptocrats. Or no, it was all done by, this is our system. The harm that is done by this system is not something that has been done to us. It's something that has been done by us.
Yeah, I mean, those holes that you're describing, I think we call them governance gaps at SIPE. And so this is where that corrosive capital enters the market and can really expand, if you could, and behind that corrosive capital comes more corrosive capital, eventually kind of undermining those fundamental institutions. So back to your original point about undermining those pillars of liberal market-oriented democracy, it erodes those. Now, there's a lot, you talk about capitalism, capitalists, or business people in your book, but to your mind, look, I mean, we owe collectively in the West our wealth to the liberal democratic system. And at the same time, in your book, you're detailing how these very same people that have, built this wealth on the back of that system are supporting the undermining of said system. Do folks understand in that kind of that top 1% class, the leading industrialists or business people do they understand that they're undermining some of the core pillars on which their very wealth is created? And why would they do that?
I don't think that they understand it satisfactorily. They know that they're walking on the edge legally in many cases. Lots of corporations, lots of billionaires have skirted the laws on tax payments, on reporting responsibilities, and so forth. But I think there is a lingering idea among a lot of the highest level capitalists that wealth creation and wealth accumulation is the higher responsibility. And so I don't think there is adequate recognition. I'm not opposed to wealth. I'm not opposed to accumulating wealth. I am opposed to it being done in such a way as to drive economic inequality, and through economic inequality to undermine democracy. I want the democratic capitalist system to survive. I think it's the best invention we've ever come up with, but it is currently being undermined by ill dealings within the capitalist component, far more so than by problems within the democracy component.
Yeah, it's a really interesting distinction that you're bringing about that the capitalist side versus the governance side. And I think, my prior personal history, within the former Soviet space and working in Russia, Ukraine, and elsewhere, we really see the debate in that community, Raymond, that where the political scientists got it wrong, but the economists, they got it right. This was the debate in the late 90s and early 2000s. Obviously, we've seen where that has gone since that period of time. But I think it just really emphasizes the point that you're making is that these two things are innately intertwined. And should one get ahead or begin to undermine the other, it really undermines the whole system itself. It begins to fall apart, unravel.
Let me add to your point, Eric, because I agree exactly with what you're saying. Democracy and capitalism are expected to work together to promote prosperity and freedom. But over the last several decades, these two fundamental pillars of our system are becoming decoupled.
Mm-hmm.
They're becoming decoupled because one of the components is trying to operate in secrecy while the other component is struggling to be as transparent as it can. This can't last. You can't have one pillar operating in secrecy and the other pillar trying to operate transparent. It simply cannot last. This has to change if the democratic capitalist system is going to survive and is going to produce prosperity in the 21st century.
Let me take a little bit of a contrarian point here, Raymond, and take a step back. While I was reading the book, the thought kept occurring to me, while inequality within countries is increasing globally, when we zoom out, inequality is decreasing. And, at the global level, we look at the wealth that's being generated, we look at the health outcomes that are being generated, and really the long lives that are being lived by humanity writ large at the global level. Now, in countries, yes, I agree. But doesn't that say that the global system is working, that global capitalism is working? We're all living longer, we're living healthier lives and wealthier lives.
Let's break that down. The biggest success in reducing poverty has been achieved in China. We've had maybe 700 million people taken out of poverty. Let's be clear, this was accomplished under authoritarian regimes. And authoritarianism means that you control both the politics and the economics of your society. So you can make people go to work for poor wages for several decades and build your society. So while millions are better off, there are other millions who lost their lives or have been forced into re-education centers in China. Let's take a contrary look at Africa. Poverty in Africa is rising as the population in Africa is rising. Nigeria, where I lived for 15 years and still stay very close to, has 100 million people living in poverty. It also has a huge percentage of its gross domestic product having been transferred illegally to the West, to UK and the United States and Switzerland and UAE countries and so forth. Estimates for Africa as a whole for poverty go up as high as 400 million by the mid-21st century or late 21st century. You mentioned the U.S. The U.S. has declining life expectancy right now. We have a lower life expectancy than many European countries, and we have a declining life expectancy in the United States. That's inexcusable. Now, let me make a larger point, if I can. For me, the proper measure of success should be what could be rather than where we are at the moment. Where we are automatically looks backward for comparisons and compares to where we were previously. Where we could be looks forward for policies that can get us there. By any measure, we could be benefiting the majority of humanity much, much more with altered policies that led to capitalism operating in a more transparent and accountable fashion. What we're doing now says, so long as the poor are a little bit better off, the rich can be infinitely better off. That's not going to work. The democratic capitalist system has to come to grips with this reality, and it has to be addressed and corrected if it's going to survive. Cannot have one system operating in secrecy and the other system operating in transparently, trying to operate with transparency. and at the same time, infinitely rising economic inequality, which is where we are at the present time. Can't survive unless this fundamentally changes.
Yeah. No, I'm not disagreeing with you, but it's one of those things, the arguments that you hear, and let's dig into that one point that you made about the Chinese system, the Chinese capital system. So look, I hear you travel around the world, you go to places like Thailand and Indonesia. They said, look, China's got a model here. They've decreased poverty, not inequality, they've increased outcomes. Why do we need this democracy stuff? What is that for? What would be your answer there? I mean, what?
That's exactly the argument that the Chinese put up and other authoritarians put up. And let's be clear, I have never known an authoritarian regime that didn't steal billions of dollars from its people. If the Chinese are so happy with their system, why are they sending trillions of dollars into foreign accounts? Why are tens of millions of Chinese seeking to leave China, seeking to get their money out of China? This underlines the interplay between economics and politics, and they've got to be working reasonably close together for systems to survive and prosper. In our organization, we've made an estimate that China has sent illegally out of China perhaps something on the order of $4 trillion. Russia, perhaps $1 trillion.
Yeah.
Let me add another point to that. A lot of us have been fighting corruption for decades, and we've been making some progress in reducing corruption in some countries. Having said that, corruption is probably moving more money today than ever before. And that's because of what is pouring out of Russia and pouring out of China. Oligarchs, wealthy people don't want to leave their money in risky regimes. And every one of these guys knows that their regimes are a little bit dicey at the present time. So get your money out into a foreign account somewhere and set the stage for you to follow your money at some point.
Yeah, there's people say one thing, but then do another. And so I'm a big believer in kind of looking at actions rather than words. And, I've met a lot of newly minted Singaporeans over the past couple of years that are recently relocated from mainland China. So it's always an interesting thing where they're touting the Chinese system on the one hand and then looking at, the relocating to Singapore on the other. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you do go through some really interesting ideas about how to fix all this. And one of those ideas that I wanted to pick out is targeting golden visas as a way to kind of back channel the undermining of democracy in markets. But then I'm thinking about the idea of Jack Ma, right? Jack Ma, brilliant guy, access to lots of capital. One of those people that is now teaching at the University of Tokyo, I think. I think a course on public policy, perhaps, or entrepreneurship. And he's living in Japan, but there's a demand for wealthy individuals to get both their money and themselves out of the country, right? Okay, why shouldn't democracies say, you know what? You're a successful entrepreneur, you're a successful business person, come live in Canada, come live in the United States, come live in France, bring your money with you, bring your business with you, and we'd be glad to have you here.
For every one of those individuals that earn their money completely honestly and completely above board and never used the financial secrecy system and never evaded taxes, there are at least 99 others that did what I've listed, and they're the ones that want to come abroad for the most part. Golden visas, as a matter of fact, highlight a fundamental relationship between democracy and capitalism. Capitalism, through lobbying, through legislation, through getting the laws that it wants, has really succeeded in buying democracy, in buying what it wants out of democracy, in buying the latitude that it has to evade taxes, utilize the financial secrecy system, accumulate wealth that can't be seen, and so forth. Golden visas are the most beautiful example of this. Capitalism is saying, man, you can earn your money any way you want to, but if you just bring it to us, we'll give you a visa that allows you to get a green card and eventually citizenship
Yeah.
and so forth. The Golden Visas program, the
EB5, I think. Yeah.
E5 program that says if you invest $500,000 or $1 million in the U.S., you can get a visa that enables you to stay in the U.S. and eventually get a green card and citizenship and so forth. This thing is a failure. The Golden Visas program has welcomed more dirty money into the United States, making it legal than any other program that we have. It's ridiculous.
Yeah. I mean, they take it that way. Yeah, perhaps there needs to be some additional guardrails put on those golden visa programs, or done away with altogether. But again, in your solutions, going back to the solutions that you presented, one of them was a reform of international financial institutions. And we have a new president of the World Bank coming in. We have a lot of bills coming due for what are called BRI, Belt and Road Initiative projects, that are technically kind of bilateral projects between China and emerging markets. We've seen the incidences in Sri Lanka and Zambia and a few other countries already about restructuring of debt and the willingness or unwillingness of the Chinese to restructure that debt. I mean, in that environment, and we had the odd situation where, we have a country like, I think it's Belgium, that has, 7 times the share of, or 6 times the shares of India in terms of voting power in the World Bank. At the same time, we have a couple of, and mentioned among them, China, a couple of authoritarian powers that, might take the reins of these IFIs, if they were allowed a proper share of these institutions. So is there hope for reform in these IFIs? I mean, what's the future of a World Bank and the IFI? What's the role in untangling the invisible trillions and trying to, because World Banks is a world without poverty, right? So where do you start? It's a big pretzel, it's a big question, so apologies.
You're touching a point that has been of concern to me for decades. The World Bank and the IMF will not touch the subject matter of illicit financial flows, money that pours out of other countries into wealthier countries. They just won't get deeply into that subject matter. They will say this is a problem of the countries themselves not collecting their taxes. It's your fault. It's your responsibility. You over there. The World Bank and the IMF have never put both sides of the equation for economic development on the table. Both sides of the economic equation means money going into developing countries, money coming out of developing countries. They will look at the money going in, the foreign aid and foreign direct investment, and they will say, look, how much is flowing into these countries, but they won't touch the question of how much is coming out of those countries. Why won't they touch it? Because that money comes to us.
Yeah.
In the richer countries, the United States and Europe and so forth, and the World Bank and the IMF will not touch the hand that feeds them. This has been a major flaw in the bank for decades. And with the rising power of China, which is the world's biggest mover of illicit money, I don't see the World Bank and the IMF putting both sides of the development equation on the table. I'm delighted we finally have in the World Bank a person whose roots are deep in the developing world and has international clout. And I hope he'll put both sides of the equation on the table. But it will be a huge fight in those organizations because the U.S. and Europe in particular do not want to address this question of how much money flows out of other countries into our economies. Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me, and it's a very let's say old-fashioned way of looking at the world, and kind of what's the old the white man's burden type of view that we the West have to take these poor impoverished nations upon ourselves, and we as the better angels need to help these poor people. I mean, it removes a lot of agency from the recipient countries and the countries that are moving money back into the West. And I think it's a very antiquated view of the world to not view it as a whole. And I think, Raymond, overall, we always hear about, and I think this is the fault of economists who have gotten more and more into the quantitative analysis, where they're trying to measure everything and trying to assign a specific value and in their formula to plug in X, Y, Z, and outcome is A. And it's a very mechanical way of the world. But I think what you were talking about, and probably what I believe in too, is a little more of a kind of a ecosystem or biological connection or relationship rather than something that's mechanical. People are people. And the last point that I want to get to, we're running up on time, but to this end, and the systems and recognizing humanity. The last point, and I'm as an MBA student that really loved his business ethics course. I really enjoyed Kantian ethics as applied to business decisions. It's fascinating stuff to think through. And in your book, you're talking about morality in democratic capital. And to close this out, could you really dig into a bit of that in your conclusion of your book and how morality intersects with all of these systems that we're talking about?
Excellent question, Eric. And let me personalize that, if I may. My father was the most honest person that I have ever known. He was a businessman for 30 years in his community, became the chairman of the finance committee of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce at a point, conducted himself with integrity for decades. Finally, in the mid-1950s, the biggest bank in town came along and offered him the presidency of the bank. And he understood banking. He'd been a director of a bank, but they did that because he had a statewide reputation, community-wide, in fact, nationally wide reputation for integrity in his dealings. I never saw my father try to maximize his profits on a transaction. Every single transaction, he was trying to come to a fair price, fair to him, fair to the other person. The reputation that he developed in the community was unassailable. That's what he wanted. He wanted to be seen as a person of character, and at the same time to be seen as a successful business person. And he achieved that. How many people can you say that about today, that never try to maximize their profit on a transaction, just want to come to a fair price, fair to everybody? The capitalist system can produce people that meet both of Adam Smith's requirements. That is, morality coupled with economic prosperity. It is possible to do that. There are just not many examples of that at the present time.
Raymond, it sounds like you're talking about Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, because those are the people that talk about that fairness and coming to a fair conclusion. Maybe we need more Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. It's a plug for those systems. Raymond, I really want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for writing Invisible Trillions. It's given me a lot to think about. I know a lot of my colleagues have read this book, and I really wish you the best at Global Financial Integrity. We here at the Center for National Private Enterprise follow your work, support your work, and really look forward to whatever's next and supporting you in bringing these messages to Capitol Hill, to Brussels, and around the world. Thank you for your time. It's a pleasure to talk.
My pleasure entirely. Thank you.
Democracy That Delivers has been brought to you by the Center for International Private Enterprise. For more information, please visit cipe.org.